flights are going out.
Are they?
Yeah, of course they will. We've only got the room booked from a certain time to a certain time.
For 6 hours, we paid for 6 hours.
Well, that's fine then. We'll be fine.
Yeah.
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 I don't think you're going to go on for another 3 hours, is it?
No. Do you want me to check? You alright? I know the duty phone.
I think this is the lady's phone. This is the lady's phone. It's not mine.
Welcome back, everybody. And the second part of this talk is about vaccine mandates. May I begin by saying a special thank you to a wonderful lady called Denise, who is the inspiration for this part of the talk. Compulsory vaccination means different things in different countries. You'll be familiar with terms such as pass sanitaire in Europe, vaccination certificate, and COVID passport all being used. There are many examples from around the world. I'll just give you a few. Since the 30th of October this year, only fully vaccinated persons can board a plane or an intercity train in Canada. In Austria, Chancellor Alexander Schallenberg announced last month that as from the 1st of February next year, COVID vaccination will become compulsory in Austria. And non-compliance by anyone over the age of 14 is proposed to be punishable by a fine of up to €3,600 every 3 months. In Greece, Prime Minister Mr. Mitsotakis announced that as from the 16th of January next year, all citizens over the age of 60 will be fined €100 a month if they are not vaccinated. Last year, as we know, lockdown restrictions were introduced when there were no vaccines. This year, there are lockdown restrictions even with vaccines. Consider the incentives which have been offered by various governments to be vaccinated, what I would call the carrot approach. Prior to the introduction of vaccine mandates, many governments desperately tried to encourage uptake by offering a range of incentives. In Oregon, in the United States of America, the state ran a draw just for vaccinated students with the chance to win 5 college scholarships worth $100,000 each. In Washington State, under its Joints for Jabs promotion, anyone over age 21 or more could receive a free pre-rolled cannabis joint if they were vaccinated. And in Indiana, anyone who was vaccinated at a designated site could receive a box of Girl Scout cookies. So, a very important issue is this: why are some people not being vaccinated? Because despite such increasingly bizarre incentives, around 10% of the eligible population is still unvaccinated. They are usually just referred to as the unvaccinated. They are very rarely given a voice, but why are they deciding not to be vaccinated? And who are they? Well, you're looking at one now, me. There's 2 categories of unvaccinated persons. Firstly, those who cannot be vaccinated. This is a group who, even if they wanted to, have particular medical conditions such as allergies or pregnancy, which may preclude vaccination in individual circumstances. The second, more elusive group comprises of those who have consciously decided not to be vaccinated. And I think it is important to articulate some of those reasons to finally give some public airtime and vocalise the other side of the debate. First reason is safety. The Moderna and Pfizer vaccines use relatively new mRNA technology. In addition, COVID vaccines initially received only temporary or emergency use authorization. I do make the point that that has changed. For some of them, they now have received their marketing authorization, but certainly for the first 12 months it was emergency use or temporary authorization. And that was because the vaccines did not go through all of the usual testing procedures. The testing pool was relatively small. I've got an 82-year-old friend who had his flu jab last November. He had 2 AstraZeneca COVID vaccines in the spring. He had another flu jab in October, and he's had his COVID booster a few weeks ago. So he's had 5 coronavirus injections within 12 months. There's no real-world data on the cumulative effect on the body of those different injections within such a short space of time, because this has never been done before. Those of a certain age will recall the horrifying thalidomide medical scandal. Thalidomide was a medicine for morning sickness, and it was developed by a German pharmaceutical company called Grunenthal and was licensed by the UK government in 1958, despite no tests being conducted on pregnant women. Tragically, over 2,000 babies were born in the UK with severe defects and deformities. The drug was withdrawn 3 years later in 1961, and subsequent civil legal action led to a multi-million-pound settlement for UK victims. And interestingly, several company officials stood criminal trial in Germany for negligent homicide. Then there are, still within the safety reason, there are adverse reactions to COVID vaccination. And we've already seen that. If you could put up clip 20, please. AstraZeneca, Moderna, Pfizer. But if you add them up, the combined figures are there. And behind that 395,000, that cold statistic, are individual people made sick with strokes, heart attacks, and many other conditions. Quite remarkable figures just for the UK. Second reason for not being vaccinated that I'm aware of, this is from information I've received, cultural sensitivities. The uptake of COVID vaccines among ethnic minorities is much lower than in the white population. Why is that? Part of the reason stems from a colonial history of medical abuse, particularly the use of African countries for clinical trials by pharmaceutical companies. To give just one example, the Pfizer antibiotic drug Kerbin was used in a clinical trial in Kano, Nigeria in the 1990s. Children died and were maimed in the trial, which led to a lawsuit from the Nigerian government against Pfizer over the specific issue of informed consent. Some of you may have seen the film, but read the novel, the John le Carré novel, The Constant Gardener. That's based on that true event. And its themes were international conspiracy of corrupt bureaucracy and pharmaceutical money. Another example from just last month, Reuters news agency reported that Peruvian government health workers had made an arduous 3-day boat expedition into the depths of the Amazon jungle to reach the Ororani indigenous community. And the reaction of the community leader when he met them was, "We don't know anything about COVID-19. We haven't heard of it." Some would praise the medics for their crusading vaccine zeal, whereas others despair that the lessons of previous disastrous missionary expeditions have not been learned. Should we not respect this tribe's culture and just let them be? Third reason, ingredients. If you look at clip 21, please. Now this is important because on the government's own website we now see what the active ingredient of the AstraZeneca vaccine is. And it uses a genetically modified chimpanzee cold virus. You can see it here. Conflict replication deficient chimpanzee adenovirus vector. For some people, this raises serious philosophical issues in relation to the use of a virus from another species, and also, importantly, Some people are very concerned about GM food. Well, this is genetically modified organisms. We can see it. Genetically modified human embryonic kidney. Fourth reason, animals. In addition to the use of the chimpanzee virus in the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine was tested on macaque monkeys. These points will be of acute concern to vegans and vegetarians. And it really is stretching credulity for the government to state that the AstraZeneca vaccine does not contain animal products, when its active or main ingredient is a genetically modified chimpanzee virus. Fifth reason, human fetus. The AstraZeneca vaccine uses a host cell line called HEK293. You can see it here. What HEK means is human embryonic kidney. Again, this is of the government's website. HEK stands for human embryonic kidney. This is because HEK293 cells are clones taken from the kidney of a legally aborted female fetus. Let me repeat that. HEK293 cells are clones taken from the kidney of a legally aborted female human fetus. The AstraZeneca vaccine is produced using clone cells from a human fetus, although the manufacturing process attempts to remove such clone cells from the final vaccine by filtration. In addition, both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines use the HEK293 cell line. They used it to test their vaccines. So in other words, all three vaccines use cloned human cells in one way or another. Such use of an aborted fetus and the use of clone technology raises great moral issues for some people, including faith groups. Sixth reason, prevention. There are those who sincerely believe in the wisdom of long-term healthy lifestyles. Drinking sufficient water, taking outdoor daily exercise, moderate amounts of sunshine, eating fruit and vegetables, whole grains and nuts, oily fish and fermented foods, whilst at the same time reducing consumption of alcohol, refined sugar, red meat, processed food, and stopping smoking. I'm often reminded at home to have my kimchi. Let food be your medicine and medicine be your food, said Hippocrates, the father of medicine. Seventh reason, treatment. Linked to prevention, there are those who believe that COVID vaccination is not necessary because the illness can be treated adequately. For example, the early treatment protocol of Professor Peter McCulloch includes a multi-drug antiviral therapy incorporating vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, and quercetin. That's a plant extract. And it's interesting to note that Pfizer now has a drug authorized to treat COVID, which seems a little curious given that its vaccine is supposedly extremely effective at preventing illness in the first place. Eighth reason, efficiency. I saw on ITV a few weeks ago, a Welsh lady was interviewed in I think it was Cardiff, and she was asked would she support further lockdown measures, and she replied, I quote, "I've got friends in hospital who have had both doses, and I've had the jabs. I don't understand it anymore. I thought we were supposed to be immune." So the conventional notion of a vaccine, for example smallpox, is that you have it once and are then completely resistant against smallpox for the rest of your life. Given that COVID vaccines only give limited protection, and apparently only for a few months, perhaps they don't meet the usual definition of vaccine, and should instead be called medical intervention. So the use of the term vaccine is therefore highly questionable. Ninth reason, recovery. There are those who've had COVID and are satisfied they now have sufficient natural immunity not to need vaccination. Similarly, there are those who believe that natural immunity from previous colds and flu will provide sufficient resilience to deal with COVID-19. Now, this notion was initially rubbished by some commentators, but very interesting research on healthcare staff published in November this year by the University College of London found that that was indeed the case. In simple terms, some people retain antibodies and T cells from previous colds, which are able to tackle different coronaviruses such as COVID-19 in the future. The last reason, overreaction. There are simply those who believe that the threat posed by COVID to the entire population has been grossly exaggerated, that whilst it may pose a serious risk of harm to some elderly or vulnerable persons, for most persons the symptoms will be relatively mild, no worse than the flu. This group hasn't been vaccinated for flu before and see no reason to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Simply put, they are fed up with Alpha, Delta, Omicron, and the threat of perpetual boosters and believe we should just get on with our lives and learn to live with COVID. There will be people who believe in one, several, or all of those reasons. Whether any of those reasons reach the legal threshold of a belief under the European Convention on Human Rights or the Equality Act will ultimately be a matter for the court to decide. But in another sense, it doesn't matter at all, because for the person who sincerely holds any of those thoughts, they are true and meaningful and sufficient reasons for them. And ultimately, isn't that enough? That it is a person's sovereign choice what happens with their own body. The phrase, my body, my choice, was the mantra that won the pro-abortion debate, and is the phrase currently being coined to advance the assisted dying agenda. Why is that not equally valid in relation to vaccination? So why have vaccine mandates been introduced? The stick approach. There appears to be three main reasons. One, to increase vaccination uptake. We know that the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, brazenly admitted that, I quote, the central primary objective, end quote, of her vaccine mandate was to drive up vaccination rates. We could go to clip 22, please. Already touched upon these despicable comments, but we'll refer to them again. In Austria, Chancellor Schallenberg reprehensibly stated, we have to raise the vaccination rate. We will therefore have to tighten the leash on the unvaccinated. So in other words, I'm a dog. And the Greek Prime Minister, Mr. Mitsotakis, when referring to the fines that would be imposed on the unvaccinated, that's from February, disingenuously stated, I quote, this is not a punishment, but a bonus for health, an act of justice. It certainly appears to me that many leaders are utterly convinced of their own infallibility. Second reason, so-called to keep other people safe. Now, we know, according to government statistics, that around 90% of the eligible population has already been vaccinated. According to the government, that should keep those vaccinated individuals safe from serious harm. That's the context. The argument is that the unvaccinated are spreaders of the virus and therefore could reinfect the vaccinated. That's not true. The truth is that vaccinated persons can easily spread the virus. The BBC covered a very important story this October on research carried out by the Lancet Infectious Diseases Journal. That research showed that double vaccinated persons in UK households could spread the Delta variant as readily as the unvaccinated. And the report, take a quote taken from the report, we found no evidence of lower secondary attack rate from fully vaccinated Delta index cases than for unvaccinated ones. Now, the way this research was reported in the BBC was the aim of encouraging unvaccinated persons to go out and get the jab because they weren't protected from living with vaccinated household members. However, in the process of saying that, they let the cat out of the bag that fully vaccinated persons are effective spreaders. So you could, in the absence of a testing requirement, have a hospital full of vaccinated doctors and nurses, or a nightclub full of vaccinated customers, but all would be entirely capable of spreading the virus amongst themselves and to others. A recent striking example of this was the cruise liner Norwegian Breakaway. That's a cruise liner, and it disembarked in New Orleans last week. It was on the 5th of December, amid an onboard outbreak of COVID, despite all the crew and all the passengers being fully vaccinated. Therefore, there is no logic or scientific basis for excluding the unvaccinated as posing a significantly higher risk to others. And if it is the case that unvaccinated doctors and nurses pose such a threat to patients' right now. Why is the UK government not bringing in compulsory vaccination for NH staff immediately, instead of waiting another 4 months until April? Is this an indication of the truth that they in fact do not pose any higher risk to patients? The third reason, to protect the unvaccinated. Now that's getting plain silly. Will the government now be considering banning smoking or drinking or the TT's motorcycle races so as to protect people from themselves, reduce pressure on the NHS and eliminate all risk in life? Maybe I'll start a petition banning avocados. Every year, 200 people are reportedly treated at Chelsea Hospital in London for hand injuries caused whilst cutting open avocados. Let's ban avocados and that risk will be eliminated. So which human rights are engaged when we think about compulsory vaccination? So we need to distinguish between a law passed by government making vaccination compulsory for all or to access public services, and a separate situation where a private business just takes it upon itself to introduce a vaccine requirement. In the former case, a legal requirement would be susceptible to challenge in court. A wholesale review of constitutional and international human rights issues would have to be undertaken. Vicky referred to it before, and it's the very important case of Wawrinka and others via the Czech Republic. On the face of it, this is a very scary judgment for some of you. It was a case dealing with child vaccination, and on the 8th of April this year, the Grand Chamber of the Court gave its ruling on the question of the compulsory vaccination of children. And Mr. Wawrinka was a Czech national, is a Czech national, and he refused to vaccinate his 2 children for a range of 9 childhood illnesses such as polio and hepatitis B. The Czech Republic has a law requiring all children to be vaccinated against those diseases in order to attend nursery school. Mr. Wawrinka didn't have his children vaccinated, and he was fined €110, that's the equivalent of £100, for breaking that law, and his children were prohibited from attending nursery school. And we relied on Article 8 in relation to bodily autonomy and the rights, his rights to make decisions for his children, and also Article 9, that he believed vaccination caused damage to his children, would cause damage to his children's health, and his conscience would not allow him to have his children vaccinated. The court had to consider separately the Article 8 rights of the child, such as their right to attend nursery, and also parents' Article 8 rights. And sadly, for some, the court ruled that the vaccination requirement in the Czech Republic was lawful, and that although Mr. Wawrinka's Article rights had been interfered with, not unlawfully. And that is because Article 8, remember the difference between absolute and qualified. Article 8 is a qualified right and can be interfered with in pursuit of a legitimate aim if necessary. And the court held that the mandatory vaccination law in Czechoslovakia was imposed with the aim of protecting the health of children. The court held that a small fine and exclusion from nursery school was not disproportionate. In addition, the court held that Mr. Wawrinka's Article 9 rights had not been violated because he had not established that his critical opinion on vaccination was of sufficient strength, seriousness and cohesion and importance to constitute a conviction of belief, benefiting from the protection of Article 9. I want to make it clear that that court found that the compulsory vaccination of children for those 9 illnesses in Czechoslovakia was not unlawful. That's entirely separate from the notion of enforced vaccination, dragging people out, sticking needles in them. The court in no way endorses physical vaccination. The question is, following on from that, what would the European Court of Human Rights say about compulsory COVID vaccination? So, I think there are important distinctions, 5 important distinctions. Firstly, the Wawrinka case only concerned nursery school-aged children. Non-vaccination was a bar to those children attending nursery school, but not primary school or secondary school. In other words, unvaccinated children could still attend primary and secondary schools in the Czech Republic. If the UK or Isle of Man government introduced a COVID vaccination mandate for attendance at primary or secondary school, that would clearly be a significantly different circumstance than in Vavrika, given that any exclusion would last for many years. Secondly, the scientific justification referred to in the Vavrika judgment was on the basis that vaccination for illnesses such as polio was necessary to protect the child's physical health. This is something that Victoria's touched on. The UK government's justification for COVID vaccination being offered to 11 to 15-year-olds in the UK is not to protect the child's physical health, but to prevent the child from having to take time off school and thereby having their education disrupted. In other words, for the child's indirect benefit, not direct physical benefit. Thirdly, the risk to children's health from polio, measles is, some would argue, much greater than from COVID. That even if a child were to develop COVID, in most cases the symptoms would be only mild as opposed to potentially life-threatening consequences of polio. Fourthly, the Vavrika judgment leaves open the door to a claimant establishing a proper and sufficient belief which would be protected under Article 9. And finally, the size of the fine in Vavrika was a modest one-off payment of 110 euros. Obviously, in stark contrast to the position in Austria, where the government is proposing a huge fine of up to 3,600 euros, we believe, every 3 months. Now, I mention this case as a clear warning of what could be potentially coming your way. There is hope, but it is vital that you galvanise a campaign to prevent compulsory vaccination ever becoming law. Presently, the starting point in UK law is that patients must give their consent to any medical treatment, and therefore mandatory medical treatment, including vaccinations, is currently unlawful. A general vaccine mandate affecting everyone in society would require a change in primary legislation. And again, Victoria's referred to the Nuremberg Code. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And remember, this code has its roots in those horrifying scenes we saw in Auschwitz, where people were subjected to medical experiments without their consent. This code, introduced a few years later, voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It says that because of those horrific circumstances we saw in the Second World War. Now, a vaccine requirement in order to do a particular job or to enter particular premises is different from a universal vaccine requirement. For example, in the USA, President Biden has passed a decree ordering that by the 4th of January, all companies with 100 employees or more will be required, their staff will be required to either be vaccinated or submit a negative COVID test. That's currently being challenged by a number of Republican Attorney Generals, and the US Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit has halted that requirement on the grounds that it was, I quote, fatally flawed and staggeringly overboard and raised serious constitutional concerns, and clearly that matter will now be decided in the Supreme Court. You may have heard about the situation in England where care workers now in effect have to be double vaccinated in order to work in care homes. Again, a challenging case, shall we say, the case of Peters, the Secretary of State for Health. This is a case that was before the court just last month. And the legal challenge was based on Section 45E of the Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984. But the court dismissed the challenge on the grounds that an individual retains the choice whether to be vaccinated or not, and so therefore the regulations were not equivalent to compulsory medical treatment. You've got a choice whether you work in a care home or not. So let's consider the second situation, namely where a private business unilaterally decides to introduce a vaccine mandate. For example, a shoe shop in Strand Street puts a sign on the door, all customers must be vaccinated. Or a cafe puts an advert in the courier stating, wanted barista must be COVID vaccinated. Or a life insurance company introduces a new employment policy insisting that all existing employees must be vaccinated. What rights do you have if you're an unvaccinated customer of the shoe shop or wish to apply for the cafe job or are an existing employee of the life insurance company? Go to clip 7 again, please. This is where the Equality Act comes in. The UK Equality Act 2010 in effect combines the Race Relations Act, Equal Pay Act and Disability Discrimination Act with other considerations to create one overarching anti-discrimination law. And the Isle of Man 2017 Act largely mirrors this. Why is that important? Because discrimination, in very simple terms, makes people feel bad about themselves. Treating people unfavourably, for example, because of their skin colour or sex or beliefs, makes those individuals feel inferior, resentful and unhappy. The Equality Act represents the culmination of decades of campaigning and protests against racial discrimination, low pay for women, and the exclusion of disabled persons from large sections of public life. These are the 9 protected characteristics of the Equality Act. It is possible that, in one of those examples I've given, that if you were not vaccinated, you may have been unlawfully discriminated against, potentially on the grounds of race, and I've discussed the cultural sensitivities issue, potentially on the grounds of disability. Let's consider another characteristic, that of religion or belief. Religion refers to any religion, and belief can include any cogent philosophical belief genuinely held. Recently, even man-made climate change has been held to be an acceptable belief. It will certainly be interesting to see how the various anti-vaccination beliefs are viewed by the court in cases alleging discrimination, harassment and victimisation. It's quite possible that a person with anti-vaccination beliefs based, for example, on Catholicism or veganism could successfully claim that they've been unlawfully discriminated against, either directly, that's, in other words, they were treated worse than another person because of their belief, or indirectly, in other words, where a policy is applied to everyone, but the anti-vaccine person, pro-choice person, is put at a particular disadvantage because of that belief. Then we come to the Data Protection Act. I referred to that earlier on, and this gives important rights regarding confidentiality. Clearly, we're now in a situation in many parts of the world where people are being asked to show proof of vaccination or proof of a negative test just to access a shop, different premises. In Scotland, the situation changed last week, where the COVID certificate was changed to include a negative test, but for 2 months. You could only get into a nightclub in Scotland or a large football event if and only if you were vaccinated. Now, you had to be ready to show your NHS COVID pass on your mobile phone to a door steward. And in England, as we know, from tomorrow, in fact, a person will need to show proof of vaccination or proof of a negative test in order to access nightclubs and large sporting events. This obviously entails revealing your confidential personal medical data. Why should you do that? This event tonight, for example, was open to all, no pre-booking or registration because of concerns about this very issue. Last year, prior to the introduction of COVID vaccinations, many pubs and restaurants were requesting, for contact tracing purposes, that customers provide their name and phone number as a condition of entry. The NHS COVID pass is even more intrusive because you're now being asked to reveal your private medical history. Why is it not okay for a doorman to ask whether a woman is on the pill, or if a man is HIV positive, but it is okay to ask about someone's vaccine status? Clearly there is an interplay here with Article 8, European Convention on Human Rights, as that article covers respect for correspondence, and correspondence includes medical records. There's also an interplay with the Equality Act, which places strict restrictions on the questions an employer can ask, legally ask employees, or about the health of new applicants. Now, in addition to those legal rights, we need to consider ethical issues regarding COVID vaccine mandates. The first one is coercion. You will recall those detestable remarks of Chancellor Schallenberg in Austria referring to tightening the leash on the unvaccinated. And this is from the leader of the country where Adolf Hitler was born. Of all the countries in the world, he said that, tightening the leash on the unvaccinated. The first Minister of Scotland openly stated that the primary objective of the vaccine mandate was to increase vaccine uptake. Let's call a spade here. This is coercion. This is bullying. This is oppressive, and it's extremely unsavoury. Consider, by way of analogy, the criminal offence of coercive control. In England, under Section 76 Serious Crime Act 2015, that created a new offence of controlling and coercive behaviour in a family relationship. Some would argue that this is exactly what governments are doing with COVID mandates, seeking to exert emotional and psychological pressure on unwilling vaccine participants in a marriage that could be a crime. Second ethical issue, the notion of brotherhood. You will recall one of our first slides tonight was of the UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And there is reference in that to human beings acting together in a spirit of brotherhood. Now here's a thought for you. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, will be disgracefully stated in January this year, at the time of receiving his jab, that COVID vaccination was, I quote, an answer to prayer and getting the vaccine as part of the commandment to love your neighbour. An answer to prayer and getting the vaccine as part of the commandment to love your neighbour. So by implication, if you choose not to be vaccinated, you are disobeying God. My retort to that is, what is Christian, what is merciful about stigmatizing, excluding, and scapegoating the unvaccinated? Third moral issue, duty. Some people raise the issue with the unvaccinated about doing their duty and acting responsibly. Well, I'll tell you this, my primary duty is to the truth. My responsibility is to make my own decisions and take responsibility for my own health. And what on earth is responsible about government and the media recklessly engendering terror throughout society? What has the reaction been around the world to this intimidation and recent restrictions? Page 24, please.
last of me, but I will not be leaving quietly. No, I won't leave. I won't leave. I will not be leaving quietly. I'm gonna stand there and I'll fight for every word. I'm gonna shout the truth until you know it's heard. I'm gonna stand there and I'll fight for every word. I'm gonna shout the truth until you know it's heard. Yeah, yeah. You can hate me, try to break me, talk me down and denigrate me. You can try to silence every word, but I will not be leaving quietly. Nah, I won't leave. I won't leave. I will not be leaving quietly. Now, I won't leave. I won't leave. I will not be leaving quietly. No, I won't leave. I won't leave. I will not be leaving quietly.
There have been huge protests across the world against tyranny. So my message to anyone who shares these sentiments is that you are not alone, but we are all part of a wonderful international fellowship of freedom. Let me conclude tonight by saying this. When you consider the sweeping restrictions and vaccine mandates that are being introduced around the world right now, it is clear that these are not isolated events. The tide is flowing in one direction. Something is happening in the minds and spirits of leaders and decision makers. That something is called authoritarianism, because at the very time civil liberties have never been more relevant, they also seem to be never more imperiled. Despite 70 years of quietly evolving human rights jurisprudence, it is as if the current crop of politicians do not know about citizens' rights, or have forgotten about them, or are prepared to overlook them. At one end of the spectrum, there are people who would happily let the police adopt a policy of, from monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect £200, go straight to jail. The recent letter writer of the Isle of Man to the Isle of Man Examiner, who stated that the unvaccinated, I quote, do not deserve respect, end quote, would be at that end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, there are those, both vaccinated and unvaccinated, men and women, black and white, young and old, left and right, all united in putting choice first. I'm in that group, and I nailed my colours to the mast very early on in this pandemic. And why did I do that? Let me put it this way. When I was a boy growing up in my village of Kermode, I spent a lot of time playing outside in the countryside. As a cub, on adventures in Spookbane, swimming in the sea at Ballyra Beach, picking blaeberries on the wilds of Slough-Rain. Our primary school headmaster, Mr. Cashin, encouraged us to learn the Manx National off by heart. I knew it and sing it from the age of 5. Go to clip 25. And this is the Manx National Anthem. O land of our birth, O gem of God's earth, O island so strong and so fair, O firmest Barul, thy throne of home rule makes us free as thy sweet mountain air. As free as thy sweet mountain air. As free as thy sweet mountain air. So freedom is in my soul. And as a young man at university, my earnest quest was to seek the truth, and that remains the case today. The authorities can stop me from eating at restaurants, ban me from entering cinemas, prevent me from travelling, bar me from using buses, even lock me in German prison. But no one will stop me thinking my own thoughts, no one will stop me being true to myself, and no one will ever extinguish my love of freedom. So my appeal to you is this. The time has come for you also to decide whose side you are on in this war against the evil of authoritarianism. Are you sick of Big Brother interference in your business? Do you feel a burning sense of injustice at the treatment of the unvaccinated? Do you hear the alarm bells of historic prejudice ringing in your ears? Are you fed up at being treated like a fool? Is there fire in your belly to march for equality? Will you pledge to fight for the truth? And above all, will you be a champion of freedom? Thank you.